The sound of the slap was louder than the thumping bass of the penthouse party. A sharp, stinging crack that silenced the room instantly. Elena's head snapped to the side, her cheek blooming into a violent shade of crimson, as her husband, Julian, stood over her with a sneer of pure contempt. He didn't just hit her, he laughed, gesturing to his circle of wealthy, mocking friends who looked on with cruel amusement. "Look at her," Julian mocked, his voice dripping with venom. "The pathetic little mouse I rescued from the gutter. She's forgotten her place." He had no idea that at that very moment, the fragile mask Elena had worn for 5 years hadn't just slipped. It had shattered. He didn't know that the woman he just struck was once the most feared shadow in the underground circuits of East Asia, a master of lethality who had retired to find peace. As the guests chuckled and Julian turned his back to pour another drink, Elena felt a cold, familiar stillness settle into her bones, a predatory focus she had tried to bury forever. The mouse was gone and the master had returned, and before the sun rose, every single person in that room would understand the true cost of their arrogance. The evening had started like any other high society gala. Julian insisted they attend. Elena had spent 2 hours in front of the mirror, carefully applying makeup to hide the subtle sharpness in her jawline and the calluses on her knuckles that never truly went away. She wore a silk emerald dress, chosen by Julian, because it made her look soft, elegant, and most importantly, subservient. For 5 years, this had been her life. She had met Julian during a time of profound exhaustion, right after she had walked away from a life of violence that most people only saw in fever dreams. She wanted a home, a garden, and a man who didn't know how to kill with his bare hands. Julian appeared to be that man. A successful architect, charming, and seemingly devoted. But as the years passed, the charm curdled into control. The devotion turned into a sick need for dominance. He loved the idea of a beautiful, quiet wife who never spoke back, never questioned his late nights and never challenged his ego. He treated her like a trophy, one that he could polish or kick depending on his mood. Tonight, Julian was riding high on a massive contract win, and his ego was at an all-time peak. He was surrounded by his inner circle, men like Marcus, a crooked lawyer, and Silas, a trust fund brat who enjoyed hurting people because he could afford the settlements. They had been drinking heavily in the private lounge of Julian's sprawling estate. Elena had been serving them drinks, moving like a ghost, trying to remain invisible. But Silas had made a crude comment about her, and for the first time in years, Elena hadn't looked down. She had looked Silas directly in the eyes, her gaze cold and piercing. It was a look that had once made warlords tremble, and it had unnerved Silas so much that he stumbled over his words. Embarrassed in front of his friends, Silas had whispered something to Julian, sparking the fire. Julian, feeling his property had stepped out of line by making his friend uncomfortable, decided to put on a show. He had called her over, grabbed her arm too tightly, and began the verbal undressing. He spoke about her lowly beginnings, her lack of family, her supposed debt to him for providing her with a life of luxury. He wanted her to cry. He wanted her to beg for forgiveness in front of the men he respected. But Elena didn't cry. She stood there, perfectly still, her breathing rhythmic and deep. This lack of reaction infuriated Julian more than an insult would have. It was a defiance he couldn't name. That was when he swung. The blow was clumsy, fueled by scotch and malice, but it carried enough weight to bruise. As the sting on her face transformed into a dull, pulsing heat, the world around Elena seemed to slow down. Her peripheral vision expanded, taking in the exits, the positions of the men, the heavy glass decanters on the table, and the sharp edges of the marble furniture. In her mind, she wasn't a humiliated wife. She was a tactician. She calculated the distance between her and Julian's throat. She saw the opening in Marcus's stance. She felt the weight of her own body, centered and lethal. For years she had suppressed the tiger style she had mastered under the tutelage of the Grandmaster in the mountains of Yunnan. She had told herself that she was Elena, the wife. But as Julian turned back toward her, a glass of whiskey in his hand and a smirk on his face, she realized she had been lying to herself. You can take the tiger out of the jungle, but the jungle never leaves the tiger. Julian reached out to pat her bruised cheek, a patronizing gesture intended to end the confrontation. "Now go upstairs and clean yourself up," he said. "You're ruining the view." Elena didn't move. She didn't blink. She simply looked at him, and for the first time, Julian felt a cold shiver run down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Julian didn't recognize the shift in the air, but the room felt suddenly pressurized, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the space. He saw the coldness in Elena's eyes, and for a fleeting second, he felt an instinctive urge to step back. But his pride, bolstered by the alcohol and the presence of his peers, pushed him forward. He reached out again, intending to shove her shoulder to get her moving, but his hand never connected. With a movement so fluid and fast it was almost invisible to the naked eye, Elena caught his wrist. Her grip wasn't that of a fragile woman. It felt like a band of cold, unyielding steel. Julian gasped, his face twisting in confusion and sudden pain as she applied pressure to a specific nerve point. The whiskey glass slipped from his other hand, shattering against the marble floor with a sharp ring that punctuated the silence. The friends around the table stopped laughing. Marcus, the lawyer, stood up, sensing a change in the atmosphere. "Hey, Julian, what's going on?" he asked, his voice wavering. Julian tried to pull his arm away, but the more he struggled, the more his bones felt like they were being crushed in a vice. He looked down at Elena, and for the first time in their marriage, he saw her, truly saw her. Her posture had changed. The submissive slouch was gone, replaced by a spine of iron and a terrifyingly calm facial expression. She looked at him not with anger, but with the detached observation of a predator deciding where to strike. Then, she spoke. Her voice was low, devoid of the soft melodic tone she usually used. It was a rasp that sounded like a blade being drawn from a scabbard. "You told me to remember my place, Julian, but you've spent 5 years forgetting yours." With a sharp, flicking motion, she sent Julian stumbling backward into the glass-topped coffee table. The table didn't break, but the impact left him breathless. The room erupted. Silas, the youngest and most reckless of the group, surged forward, fueled by a misguided sense of bravado. "What do you think you're doing, you crazy bitch?" he yelled, swinging a heavy fist toward Elena's head. He was a gym rat, strong and fast, but to Elena he was moving in slow motion. She stepped inside his guard, her emerald dress swirling around her legs like a mist. She used his own momentum against him, grabbing his arm and pivoting her hips. Silas didn't even have time to scream before he was sent flying over the back of a sofa, crashing into a collection of expensive porcelain vases. The crash echoed through the penthouse, and the remaining men froze. Julian scrambled to his feet, his face red with a mixture of rage and burgeoning fear. He looked at his wife and saw a stranger. He saw the way she stood, weight balanced, hands open but ready, her eyes scanning the room with a terrifying efficiency. "Who the hell are you?" Julian spat, his voice cracking. Elena didn't answer him. Instead, she began to walk toward the center of the room, her footsteps silent on the hardwood. She was no longer the trophy wife. She was the ghost of his past mistakes. She remembered the years of quiet insults, the way he had isolated her from the world, and the way he had made her feel small so he could feel big. Every slap, every snide comment, and every moment of forced silence was bubbling to the surface. But she didn't let it explode. She channeled it into a cold, hard focus. Marcus tried to play the peacemaker, putting his hands up as he backed away. "Look, Elena, let's just calm down. Julian was just drunk. We can talk about this." Elena turned her gaze to him. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. The time for talking ended when he laid his hands on me, she said. She wasn't just talking about the slap tonight. She was talking about the systematic dismantling of her soul that he had attempted for half a decade. Julian, seeing his friends waver, tried to regain control of the situation. He grabbed a heavy decorative statue from a side table, a bronze piece that weighed at least 10 pounds. He swung it with a desperate, wild energy. Elena didn't flinch. She leaned back just an inch, the bronze whistling past her nose, and then she struck. Her palm connected with Julian's chest in a move known as the hanging palm. It wasn't a push. It was an internal strike that sent a shockwave through his ribcage. Julian's breath left him in a ragged wheeze, and he collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest. He couldn't understand how a woman half his size could hit with the force of a speeding vehicle. The power didn't come from her muscles alone. It came from the perfect alignment of her body and the release of years of suppressed chi. She looked down at him, her face a mask of indifference. "You thought I was weak because I was kind," she whispered. "You thought I was a victim because I chose peace. You were wrong." As the realization of his situation began to sink in, Julian looked at the door, hoping for security or help to arrive. But the penthouse was soundproofed for his private parties, a feature he had once bragged about. Now, that luxury had become his prison. Elena saw his eyes dart toward the exit, and she smiled, a small, predatory tilt of the lips that terrified him more than any scream could. She wasn't going to let them leave. Not yet. They had spent the night mocking her, and now it was time for the education to begin. She walked to the heavy oak doors of the lounge and turned the deadbolt with a soft click. The sound signaled the end of the party and the beginning of the reckoning. The heavy thud of the deadbolt echoed like a gavel in a courtroom. Elena stood by the door for a moment, her silhouette framed by the dim hallway lights before she turned back to the room. The atmosphere had shifted from a rowdy party to a survival situation. Silas was groaning on the floor amidst the shards of porcelain, his shoulder clearly dislocated. Marcus was trembling by the bar, his legal mind racing to find a loophole out of physical pain. And Julian was still on his knees, gasping for air, his eyes wide with a mixture of agony and disbelief. He looked at his wife, the woman he thought he had broken, and saw a warrior he didn't recognize. Elena walked slowly toward the bar, her emerald dress trailing behind her like a regal shroud. She reached out and picked up a bottle of sparkling water, twisting the cap off with effortless grace. She took a sip, her eyes never leaving Julian. "5 years, Julian," she said, her voice echoing in the silent room. 5 years of listening to your pathetic stories about how you built this empire. 5 years of watching you step on people because you thought you were bigger than them. I chose this life because I thought I could leave the shadows behind. I thought maybe, just maybe, a normal life meant being loved. But you don't know how to love. You only know how to own." Marcus found his voice, though it was thin and reedy. "Elena, listen to me. This is assault. You're going to jail for this. If you let us go now, we can say it was an accident. We can settle this quietly." Elena turned her head slightly, a cold smile touching her lips. "Assault? Marcus, you've spent your career burying the crimes of men like Julian. You know exactly what the law can and cannot do. But right now the law is very far away. Right now there is only this room." She set the bottle down and moved toward Marcus. He scrambled backward, tripping over a bar stool and falling onto the plush carpet. "You," Elena said, pointing a finger at Marcus. "You helped Julian hide the assets he stole from his first business partner. You're the one who drafted the NDAs for the women he harassed before me. You think your silk suit and your law degree make you untouchable. But in a fight, you're just a collection of soft tissue and bad intentions. She moved with a sudden explosive burst of speed. Before Marcus could scramble away, she had him by the collar. With a single fluid motion, she hoisted him up and pinned him against the mahogany paneling of the bar. She didn't hit him. She simply held him there, her face inches from his. "I could stop your heart with a single strike to the solar plexus," she whispered. "Do you want to see if your insurance covers that?" Marcus shook his head frantically, his eyes bulging. Elena let him go, and he slumped to the floor, a broken shell of a man. She then turned her attention back to Silas, who was trying to crawl toward his phone, which had fallen near the sofa. Elena's foot came down on the device just as his fingers touched it, crushing the screen into a web of glass and black ink. Silas looked up, tears of pain and fear streaming down his face. "Please," he whimpered. "I didn't do anything. It was Julian's idea." "It's always someone else's idea with men like you," Elena replied. She looked down at him with genuine pity. "You spend your father's money to buy the feeling of power, but you have no strength of your own. You mocked me tonight because you thought I was a servant. You thought I was beneath you." She reached down, grabbed his good arm, and with a precise twist, applied a joint lock that forced him to his knees. "This is what it feels like to be truly powerless, Silas. Remember it." She released him, and he collapsed back into the ruins of the vases. Julian had finally regained enough breath to speak. He tried to use the sofa to pull himself up, his face contorted with fury. "You think you're so tough? You're a liar. You lied to me about who you were. This whole marriage was a fraud." He was screaming now, trying to mask his terror with volume. "I'll have you destroyed. I'll tell everyone you're a violent psychopath. You'll never work again. You'll never have a cent to your name." Elena laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound that made Julian's skin crawl. "Julian, look around you. I don't want your money. I never did. I stayed because I wanted to believe I could be the person you saw, someone peaceful, but you wouldn't let me be that person. You kept poking the cage, wanting to see the animal inside. Well, congratulations. You finally succeeded." She began to unwrap the silk sash from her waist, her movements methodical and terrifyingly calm. She wound the fabric around her right hand, creating a makeshift wrap that protected her knuckles. "Tonight isn't about money or reputations," she continued, stepping over the debris toward her husband. "Tonight is about the debt you owe for every time you made me feel like I was nothing. You wanted a show for your friends? You wanted to prove how much of a man you are." She stood directly in front of him, her shadow looming large against the wall. Julian looked up, his bravado finally crumbling into pure, unadulterated dread. "The show is just beginning, Julian, and I'm the one who's going to take the final bow." She raised her wrapped hand, the emerald silk shimmering in the light, and Julian realized, with a sickening jolt, that for the first time in his life, he was facing a force he couldn't buy, bully, or break. The air in the room grew heavy as Elena stood over Julian, the emerald silk wrapped tightly around her hand. The luxury of the penthouse, with its gold leaf accents and Italian marble, now felt like a cold, hollow stage for a tragedy Julian had written himself. He looked up at her, his lips trembling, his mind finally grasping that the mouse he had tormented was a predator beyond his comprehension. "Elena, please," he stammered, his voice a pathetic shadow of the booming tone he had used to mock her just minutes ago. "We can fix this. I'll change. I'll give you whatever you want." Elena looked down at him, her expression unchanging. "You still don't get it, Julian. You think everything is a transaction. You think you can buy your way out of the consequences of your own role." She moved closer, her presence radiating a calm, terrifying power. "I didn't want your money. I wanted your respect, but you don't even respect yourself enough to be a man without an audience." Behind her, Marcus tried to crawl toward the kitchen, hoping to find another exit. Without looking back, Elena picked up a heavy crystal paperweight from a nearby desk and flicked her wrist. The crystal sailed through the air, shattering a glass cabinet just inches from Marcus's head. He froze, paralyzed by the sheer precision of the throw. "Stay where you are, Marcus," Elena said, her voice like cracking ice. "I'm not finished with any of you." She turned her focus back to Julian. She remembered the nights he had come home late, smelling of expensive perfume and cheap lies, only to belittle her for not having the status to match his ambition. She remembered the way he had once thrown a plate of food at the wall because it wasn't up to his standards, forcing her to clean it up while he laughed with Silas on the phone. All those memories were now fuel for the fire burning in her veins. Julian tried to scramble backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the spilled whiskey. "I'll give you a divorce. A massive settlement. Just let me go." He was hyperventilating now, the reality of his helplessness sinking in. Elena leaned down, her face inches from his. "A divorce? No, Julian. You don't get to just walk away after what you did tonight. You didn't just hit me. You tried to break me in front of the world." She grabbed him by the lapels of his designer jacket and hoisted him to his feet, with a strength that seemed impossible. She began to move him across the room, not with a struggle, but with a controlled, martial grace. Every time Julian tried to resist, she applied a subtle pressure to his joints or struck a meridian point that left his limbs numb. She was showing him the true meaning of Kungfu, not just the art of fighting, but the art of mastery over oneself and one's opponent. She navigated him toward the large floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the glowing city skyline. The lights of the metropolis stretched out below them like a sea of diamonds, a world that Julian thought he owned. "Look at the city, Julian," she commanded, forcing him to face the glass. "You think you're a king up here. You think everyone below you is small, but from down there, you're just a speck in a window. You're nothing." Julian looked at his reflection in the glass. He saw a man with a bruised face, ruined clothes, and eyes filled with the kind of primal fear he usually reserved for his business rivals. Behind him, he saw the silhouette of a woman who looked like a goddess of vengeance. Suddenly, Silas, who had been quiet among the broken vases, found a moment of desperate courage. He lunged from the floor, clutching a jagged piece of porcelain, aiming for Elena's back. He thought he could catch her off guard while she was distracted by Julian, but Elena's training had honed her senses to a point where she could feel the displacement of air. Without releasing her grip on Julian's collar, she executed a blind back kick. Her heel connected squarely with Silas's solar plexus. The sound of the impact was a dull thud, and Silas was folded in half, his breath leaving him in a violent spray of spit. He collapsed back down, the porcelain shard skittering across the floor, useless. Julian watched this in horror. He realized then that there was no escape. No one was coming to save him because he had spent his life surrounding himself with people just as cowardly and selfish as he was. His friends were either unconscious or cowering in their own filth. Elena turned him around to face her again. She loosened her grip on his jacket, but he was too weak to move. "Tonight," Elena whispered, "you're going to learn what it means to be truly humbled." She raised her hand, the silk-wrapped knuckles glowing under the chandelier. She didn't strike him yet. She let the anticipation build, let him feel the weight of every insult he had ever uttered. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, broken only by the sound of Julian's ragged, terrified breathing. He knew the next blow wasn't just going to hurt his body. It was going to destroy the very foundation of the man he thought he was. Elena didn't deliver a single, devastating blow. Instead, she began a rhythmic, terrifying display of precision. She struck Julian's shoulders, his ribs, and his thighs with lightning-fast jabs that felt like being hit by a hammer wrapped in velvet. It was a soft style of striking that bypassed the skin and sent vibrations deep into the muscles, causing them to seize and spasm. Julian tried to scream, but his throat felt constricted, his vocal cords paralyzed by the sheer shock to his nervous system. He sank to his floor, his legs refusing to support him, his body a map of localized agony. He looked up at her, pleading with his eyes, but Elena's gaze remained as cold as a mountain lake. "You spent years making me feel like I was a piece of furniture," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You mocked my silence. You thought I was empty because I didn't fill the room with noise like you do. But silence is where strength grows, Julian. You're loud because you're hollow." She walked over to the bar and picked up a heavy, silver-plated tray. With a flick of her wrist, she sent it spinning across the room like a disc. It sliced through the air and embedded itself into the drywall just inches above where Marcus was huddled. The lawyer let out a pathetic whimper and covered his head. Elena then turned back to the room, looking at the three men who had spent the night laughing at her expense. They were broken, not just physically but in spirit. They had seen a side of reality that their money and influence couldn't protect them from. She moved to the center of the lounge, her emerald dress now stained with the dust of the scuffle. Yet she looked more regal than she ever had during the years of forced smiles. She began to perform a slow, deliberate series of movements, a Kungfu form that was both a meditation and a threat. Each movement displaced the air with a sharp whoosh, a reminder of the power she held in reserve. "My master taught me that martial arts is the study of the self," she said, her arms moving in perfect arcs. "He told me that a true warrior never seeks a fight, but once a fight is forced upon them, they must finish it so completely that the enemy never rises again. I tried to follow the first part of that lesson with you, Julian. I gave you every chance to be a decent human being. I ignored your slights. I absorbed your anger. I tried to be the peace you lacked." She stopped mid-motion, her fist inches from a glass sculpture on a pedestal. The vibration alone caused the glass to crack. Julian was trembling violently now. The physical pain was intense, but the psychological terror was worse. He realized that his entire life, his status, his power, his marriage, had been built on a lie. He had thought he was the master of his domain, but he was merely a guest in a house, guarded by a dragon he had been foolish enough to kick. "What are you going to do to us?" he managed to wheeze out, his voice a broken rasp. Elena lowered her hands and stood perfectly still. The tiger she had unleashed was still there, prowling behind her eyes, but she had regained her absolute composure. "I'm going to do what I should have done a long time ago," she replied. "I'm going to strip away everything that gave you the illusion of power." She walked over to Julian's desk and opened his laptop, which was still logged into his various accounts from his work earlier that day. Her fingers danced across the keyboard with the same lethal efficiency she used in combat. As she worked, she spoke without looking up. "You think your wealth is your armor. You think Marcus's legal schemes make you untouchable. But I've been watching. I've been listening for 5 years. I know where the bodies are buried, Julian. I know about the offshore accounts. I know about the bridge contract you rigged. I know about the safety deposit box in Zurich." Julian's face went from a bruised red to a ghostly, sickly white. This was a different kind of strike, one that targeted his very existence. "Stop," Julian begged, trying to crawl toward her. "Elena, please, don't do this. That's my life's work." Elena stopped typing for a second and looked at him. The pity in her eyes was more cutting than any blade. "No, Julian, this is my life's work, protecting myself from people like you." She hit the enter key with a decisive click. "The files are sent, Julian. To the authorities, to your board of directors, and to the people you cheated. By tomorrow morning, the empire of Julian Vance will be nothing more than a crime scene." The silence that followed the click of the keyboard was heavier than any physical blow. Julian stared at the glowing screen, realizing that in a few seconds, Elena had dismantled the fortress of lies he had spent a decade building. His digital footprint, his hidden assets, and his dark secrets were now flowing through the fiber optic cables of the city, heading straight for the people who would dismantle him. He felt a cold sweat break out over his entire body. The penthouse, once his sanctuary of arrogance, now felt like a glass cage. Elena stood up, her movements graceful and unhurried. She walked to the center of the room, looking at the three men. Silas was still curled in a ball, gasping. Marcus was weeping silently, his face pressed against the floor, and Julian was a broken statue of a man. She felt no joy in this. There was no triumphant laughter, only the grim satisfaction of a job that needed to be done. For 5 years she had tried to be the perfect wife, bearing her instincts and her training. She had let herself be diminished, believing that the cost of peace was her own identity. She realized now that peace without respect was just a slow-motion surrender. "You all thought you were the ones in control," Elena said, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You walked through the world thinking that everyone else was just a background character in your story. You thought a woman was something to be managed, used, and discarded." She walked over to Silas and nudged the shard of porcelain away with her toe. "You, Silas, think that being born with a silver spoon gives you the right to be a parasite. You're not a man. You're a shadow of your father's bank account." Silas flinched, but he didn't even have the strength to look up. She turned to Marcus. "And you, the fixer. You've spent your life finding ways to make the truth disappear. You think laws are just puzzles for you to solve, so that bad men can keep doing bad things. Tonight the truth found you, Marcus, and there isn't a single document you can sign to make it go away." Marcus let out a choked sob, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the carpet. He was a man who lived in the world of words and contracts. He had no defense against a woman who spoke the language of action and consequence. Finally, she walked back to Julian. He was still on the floor, his eyes fixed on the laptop, as if he could somehow reach out and pull the data back from the void. "Look at me, Julian," she commanded. It wasn't a request. The sheer force of her will compelled him to lift his head. His face was a mess of bruises and tears, his expensive silk shirt torn at the collar. "You asked me who I am," she said softly. "I am the person you forgot to consider. I am the discipline you never had. I am the consequence of your choices." Julian shook his head, a desperate, hysterical laugh bubbling up in his throat. "You're a monster," he wheezed. "You've been lying to me every single day, every kiss, every dinner. It was all a lie." Elena's eyes flashed with a brief, sharp anger before returning to their icy calm. "No, Julian, I loved you. Or at least I loved the man I thought you could be. I wanted a life where I didn't have to look over my shoulder. I wanted to believe that someone could see me, really see me, without fearing me or wanting to use me. But you never saw me. You only saw a mirror for your own vanity." She reached out and took the emerald sash from her hand, slowly unwinding it. Her knuckles were slightly reddened, but otherwise she looked untouched. The silk fluttered to the floor, a discarded symbol of the life she was leaving behind. "I didn't lie about my feelings, Julian. I suppressed my nature. There's a difference. I tried to be soft for you. I tried to be the mouse. But tonight, you showed me that being soft only invites the boot. You didn't just want a wife. You wanted a victim. And that is a role I will never play again." Outside, the distant wail of a siren began to rise from the city streets below. It was a faint, lonely sound at first, but it was growing louder, heading toward the heart of the high-rent district. Julian heard it, and his eyes widened. He knew that sound. It was the sound of his world ending. He looked at Elena, a final flicker of his old arrogance sparking in his eyes. "You think you've won? You'll be arrested too! You attacked us! You destroyed my property!" Elena leaned down, her face inches from his. "I didn't attack you, Julian. I defended myself, and as for your property, you'll find that when the police arrive, they'll be much more interested in the evidence on that computer than a few broken vases and some bruised egos. Besides," she smiled, a cold, beautiful expression, "who are they going to believe? A respected architect and his drunk friends who have a history of accidents, or the quiet, devoted wife who finally had to protect herself. The sirens were no longer distant. They were screaming, the blue and red lights beginning to pulse against the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the penthouse into a chaotic blur of color. The sound was a death knell for Julian's career, but for Elena it was a signal of liberation. She walked away from her husband and headed toward the master bedroom. Behind her, she could hear Marcus trying to scramble to his feet, his frantic breathing echoing in the hollow room.
"We have to hide the laptop! Julian, get up!"
Marcus hissed, but Julian remained motionless, a man who had finally realized that his weightless world of shadows had collapsed under the gravity of truth. Inside the bedroom, Elena didn't panic. She moved with the calculated efficiency of a ghost. She pulled a small, unassuming duffel bag from the back of the closet, a bag she had kept packed for 5 years, a just-in-case that she had prayed she would never need. Inside were a few sets of simple clothes, a passport in her original name, and a stack of cash she had slowly skimmed from the household accounts over the years. She stripped off the emerald silk dress, the fabric that felt like a cage, and changed into a black tactical jumpsuit. She tied her hair back into a tight, functional knot. In the mirror, she didn't see Julian's wife. She saw the shadow, the master, the woman who had survived the harshest training grounds of the East. She returned to the living room, just as the first heavy thuds echoed against the reinforced oak doors. The police were here. Julian looked up, his eyes bloodshot, seeing her in her black gear. He looked terrified.
"Where are you going?"
he whimpered.
"You can't leave me here like this."
Elena ignored him. She walked to the balcony door and slid it open. The cold night air rushed in, whipping her hair and carrying the scent of rain and exhaust. She stood on the precipice, 40 stories above the concrete jungle, looking out over the world she was about to vanish into. "I'm going back to the real world, Julian," she said over her shoulder. "A world where actions have consequences. You should try living in it for a while, if you survive the trials." She looked at Marcus and Silas, who were now huddled together like frightened children. They had spent their lives protected by walls of glass and bank accounts, and now those walls had shattered. Elena felt no malice toward them anymore. They were simply obstacles she had cleared from her path. She had reclaimed her dignity, and in doing so, she had reminded them that true power isn't granted by a title or a bank balance. It is forged in the fire of discipline and character. As the sound of the front door being breached, the wood splintering under a battering ram, filled the apartment, Elena stepped out onto the narrow ledge of the balcony. To a normal person, it was a suicide drop. To her, it was a series of calculated vectors. She looked down and saw the industrial service elevator cage, 2 floors below, currently stationary. With a deep breath, she centered her chi, focusing every ounce of her will into her legs. She didn't jump, she flowed. She vaulted over the railing, her body spinning in mid-air to minimize wind resistance. She landed on the metal roof of the service cage with a muted thump, rolling perfectly to absorb the impact. Above her, she could hear the police swarming into the penthouse, the shouts of, "Police! Hands in the air!" and the confused, panicked babbling of Julian and his friends. She didn't look back. She climbed down the side of the cage, moving from beam to beam with the agility of a mountain cat, descending toward the darkened alleyway behind the building. By the time the officers reached the balcony to see where the suspect had gone, the alley was empty. Elena had vanished into the shadows of the city, a place where she was far more comfortable than she had ever been in a ballroom. She walked through the rain, her hood up, her face hidden from the streetlights. She felt the bruise on her cheek, the one Julian had given her. And she smiled. It was the last thing he would ever give her. The pain was already fading, replaced by a sense of profound, quiet strength. The tiger had been poked. The cage had been opened, and now the tiger was free. She reached a parked motorcycle she had hidden weeks ago, just a precaution for a day she hoped wouldn't come. She swung her leg over the seat, the engine roaring to life with a low, predatory growl. As she pulled out into the midnight traffic, she looked at the skyscraper one last time. The blue and red lights were still flashing at the top, a tiny spark in the vast darkness. Julian Vance was a ghost of her past now. She twisted the throttle and the city opened up before her, a landscape of endless possibilities for a woman who no longer had anything to hide. The roar of the motorcycle engine was the only sound in Elena's world as she sped away from the chaos of the penthouse. The wind whipped past her, cold and sharp, but it felt like a cleansing fire. Behind her, the life of Elena Vance was burning to the ground, and in its place, the woman she used to be was rising from the ashes. She didn't head for the airport or the train station. She knew Julian's reach, even in his downfall, might still trigger alarms at major hubs. Instead, she headed for the old industrial district, a place of rusted iron and long-forgotten secrets, where the shadows were deep enough to hide even a master. She pulled into a derelict warehouse, the tires of the bike crunching over broken glass. Cutting the engine, she let the silence of the night wrap around her. This was one of the many safe houses she had maintained in secret, funded by the small amounts she had diverted over the years. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil and old wood. She dismounted, her movements still possessing that predatory grace, and walked to a heavy workbench at the back. She didn't need light. She knew every inch of this space by heart. Elena reached under the workbench and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside lay her real inheritance, a set of weighted throwing needles and a pair of traditional butterfly swords, their blades gleaming even in the dim moonlight filtering through the cracked skylight. She ran a finger along the edge of the steel. This was who she was. Not a victim, not a trophy, but a practitioner of an ancient and lethal art. Julian had mocked her for being uneducated, never realizing she possessed a PhD in survival. He had laughed at her lack of family, never knowing she was part of a lineage that stretched back centuries. As she sat in the stillness, her mind drifted back to Julian. She wondered what he was doing at this exact moment. He was likely in the back of a police cruiser, his hands zip-tied, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained. He would be trying to charm the officers, trying to explain that it was all a big misunderstanding. But the evidence she had released was an avalanche. The financial fraud, the shell companies, the evidence of his accidents. It was too much for any lawyer to bury. Even Marcus, facing his own ruin, would likely turn on Julian to save his own skin. That was the thing about men like them. Their loyalty was only as thick as their bankrolls. Elena felt a strange sense of detachment. The anger that had fueled her in the penthouse had cooled into a hard, crystalline resolve. She realized that by hitting her, Julian hadn't just ended their marriage. He had set her free from the guilt of leaving. She had tried to be normal for so long that she had started to believe she was weak. She had used Julian as an anchor to keep her from drifting back into the world of violence, but the anchor had become a chain. Now that the chain was broken, she felt lighter than she had in a decade. She began to practice a slow-motion form in the center of the warehouse, her hands tracing patterns in the air. This was the iron wire set, designed to strengthen the internal organs and fortify the spirit. With every breath, she felt the tension leaving her body. She thought about the path ahead. She had money, she had new identities, and she had a set of skills that made her one of the most dangerous people on the planet. But she didn't want to return to being an assassin or a mercenary. She wanted to live on her own terms. The city outside was waking up. In a few hours, the morning news would be dominated by the scandal of the Vance Empire's collapse. There would be photos of Julian being led away in handcuffs, and the media would wonder where his mysterious wife had vanished to. Some would speculate she was a victim. Others would suspect she was a co-conspirator. None of them would ever guess the truth. Elena would be long gone by then, a ghost in a world that only saw what it wanted to see. She packed the swords and needles into her duffel bag, along with the cash and the passport. She looked around the warehouse one last time. This chapter of her life was closed. She had taught Julian and his friends a lesson they would never forget, and she had reclaimed her soul in the process. She walked to the large sliding door and pulled it open, letting the gray light of dawn spill into the room. The rain had stopped and the sky was a pale, hopeful blue. Elena stepped out into the morning, a master of her own destiny, ready to write a new story, one where she would never have to hide her strength again. The gray light of this morning mist clung to the outskirts of the city as Elena rode further away from the life she had known. Her destination was a small, quiet coastal town 300 miles to the north, a place where the air smelled of salt and the people didn't care about architectural empires or high society scandals. As she rode, she passed a roadside diner with a television flickering through the window. Even from the road, she could see Julian's face splashed across the screen. The headlines were moving fast. Vance empire collapses amidst fraud allegations, and search continues for missing wife. She didn't slow down. To the world, she was a missing person. To herself, she was finally found. Elena arrived at a small cottage she had purchased under a pseudonym 3 years prior. It was a modest place, nestled between jagged cliffs and the roaring Atlantic. Here, she spent the first few weeks in absolute silence. She spent her mornings practicing her forms on the sand, her movements becoming one with the rhythm of the waves. The tiger was no longer pacing a cage. It was roaming free, but it was no longer angry. The act of defending herself hadn't just been about physical survival. It had been a spiritual reclamation. She realized that she didn't need to hide her Kungfu to be normal. Her strength was not a burden to be concealed, but a foundation to be built upon. Meanwhile, in the city, the fallout was more catastrophic than she had imagined. Julian's legal team had crumbled under the weight of the evidence Elena had provided. Marcus, true to his nature, had signed a plea deal within 48 hours, handing over every piece of dirt he had on Julian in exchange for a reduced sentence. Silas's family had completely disowned him to protect their own reputation, leaving him to face the assault charges and the medical bills for his shattered shoulder alone. But Julian faced the worst of it. Without his money, his friends, or his prestige, he was nothing more than a broken man in a jumpsuit, waiting for a trial that would likely keep him behind bars for the rest of his prime years. Reports from the prison suggested that Julian was a shadow of his former self. He spent his days in a state of near catatonic shock, unable to comprehend how his perfect life had been dismantled by the woman he had treated like a servant. He would often tell guards stories about how his wife was a secret assassin, but they only laughed, attributing his claims to the delusions of a man who had lost everything. They saw the photos of the gentle Elena in the press and couldn't reconcile that image with the warrior Julian described. Elena had played her part so well that the truth sounded like madness. In her coastal sanctuary, Elena began to open up to the local community. She didn't tell them her history, but she didn't hide her skills either. She started a small class in the local community center, teaching the elderly Tai Chi for balance and the local women basic self-defense. She watched as her students grew more confident, their postures straightening and their eyes brightening with the realization of their own power. It was a different kind of mastery, one that wasn't about winning fights but about building people up. She found more fulfillment in watching a grandmother learn to stand firm than she ever had in the high-stakes world of the underground circuits. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, Elena sat on her porch with a cup of tea. She thought about the night of the party, the slap, the mocking laughter, and the cold snap of the deadbolt. She realized that she wasn't grateful for the pain Julian had caused, but she was grateful for the clarity it had forced upon her. He had tried to use his power to crush her, but he had only succeeded in reminding her that her power was something he could never touch. She was no longer a shadow or a secret. She was Elena, a master of her art and the captain of her soul. Years passed, and the name Elena Vance became nothing more than a footnote in a long-forgotten tabloid scandal. In the bustling coastal town where she now lived, she was known simply as Elena, the woman with the steady hands and the peaceful gaze. She had opened a small dojo overlooking the ocean, a place where the walls weren't made of gold leaf and glass, but of sturdy wood and the spirit of discipline. She no longer wore emerald silk. She wore the simple cotton gi of a teacher. Her life was no longer about hiding from the past, but about shaping a future where strength and kindness lived in perfect balance. Back in the city, Julian had finally been released from prison, though he was a ghost of the man he once was. He lived in a cramped apartment, working a menial job, haunted by the memory of that night in the penthouse. He often sat in local parks, watching people pass by, looking for a flash of emerald or a certain graceful stride. He remained convinced that he was the victim of a grand conspiracy, never realizing that the only thing that had destroyed him was his own arrogance. He had encountered a master and treated her like a servant, and that was a mistake the universe rarely forgives. One day, a young woman came to Elena's dojo. She was bruised, her shoulders hunched with the weight of someone who had been told they were small for far too long. She looked at Elena with eyes full of fear and a desperate, flickering hope. Elena didn't ask her what had happened. She didn't need to. She simply handed the girl a wooden staff and pointed to the center of the mat. "The first thing you must learn," Elena said, her voice calm and resonant, "is that no one can take your power unless you give it to them. And today, we start taking it back." As the girl began her first lesson, Elena stood by the window, watching the waves crash against the shore. She felt a profound sense of completion. The cycle of violence had been broken, replaced by a cycle of empowerment. She had used her Kungfu to protect herself, but she was using her soul to protect others. She was no longer a secret weapon. She was a beacon. The journey that had started with a slap in a penthouse had led her to a place of true belonging. She was Elena, the master of the silent shadow, and she was finally at peace. The story of the wife who was a secret master became a local legend, a reminder that you never truly know the strength of the person standing next to you. It served as a warning to the cruel and a promise to the oppressed. In the end, Julian Vance didn't lose his empire because of a few files on a laptop. He lost it because he failed to see the greatness in the woman he shared his life with. And Elena? She didn't just survive. She flourished, proving that the greatest victory isn't winning a fight, but rising above the need for one. Thank you for watching this incredible journey of justice and transformation. If you enjoyed this story of a hidden master reclaiming her power, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another thrilling tale of courage and mystery. Your support helps us bring more of these powerful stories to life. See you in the next video.